Professor Lindberg and Dr. North, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. I want to start right away with the first question. One of the basic findings of your 2024 report, which was published last month, is the level of democracy enjoyed by the average person in the world 2023 is down to 1985 levels. By country-based averages, it's back to 1998. Since 2009, almost 15 years in a row, the share of the world's population living in autocratizing countries has overshadowed the share living in democratizing countries. How do you explain broadly the trend of autocratization? What major factors have accelerated this trend?
Well, thank you. I guess that's a $1 billion question these days. And the first thing to say is really that we don't have a scientific, rigorous answer to that question, right? There are some things we know or are pretty certain about contributing to this trend, but there may be many, and the scientific community out there is still debating this. I think nobody would dispute that China has been acting against democracy since at least the mid-1990s. They were not very happy with the third wave of democratization and the end of Soviet Union and many countries around the world moving towards democracy and more respect for human rights and so on. But it's also well known that Vladimir Putin, after coming to power in Russia, affected a lot of the former Soviet republics, and now quite hands-on with an illegal invasion of Ukraine, is seeking to undermine democracy there. He's been involved with disinformation campaigns and support to radical right, reactionary, nationalist movements around in the world, especially across Europe, that undermine democracy, involvement in a number of elections, as we know, and so on. But there are also other actors, such as Saudi Arabia, that also for many years have been supporting the spread of a Salafist version of Islam that is not compatible with democracy and human rights. That used to be a microscopic little portion of the Muslim world that have spread much further and undermine democracy in various places. And we have our across the world, and not the least also now in Europe and in America, of course, this wave of rise of far right, mostly far right nationalist, reactionary and anti-pluralist political parties, leaders, movements that are undermining democracy and leading autocratization in many of these countries that we're talking about, with different kinds of nationalists, whether it's Hindu nationalism in Modi's India, or a Muslim nationalism in Erdogan's Turkey, or Christian nationalism in Hungary, or with the Pentecostals and so on support in other countries. So different flavors, but the same recipe.
Right. One of your findings in the report is, I quote, "The decline is stark in Eastern Europe and South and Central Asia." What went wrong in Eastern Europe and South and Central Asia? How do you explain this downward trend?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to say about that. I think there in Eastern Europe and across Central Asia, many also beyond these factors that I mentioned, I think there are also individual country level factors that vary by country. So the local context is important. I think in Eastern Europe, one could at least suspect, although it's hard to say that we have hard evidence on it, but it's to suspect that countries where the shift from supposedly communist before the end of the Cold War, and that radical shift to a market economy and a more liberal political sphere that came very quickly, and maybe people were expecting sort of heaven on earth to come out of that, and that didn't materialize, and many people were also financially and otherwise hurt in the process, and that can have created reactions. But I wouldn't say that's the same in South and Central Asia, and there are other processes going on there, and that there may also be a series of contextual local factors involved in every country.
Right. Another finding of the report is about Israel. I quote, Israel falls out of liberal democracy category for the first time in over 50 years. Can you please elaborate on Israel falling out of liberal democracy's league, as it was often referred to the only democracy in the region?
Yeah, for many years, Israel was the only liberal democracy in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we see this year, in 2023, there was a decline, a substantial decline in the indicator that measures transparency and predictability of laws. And that was mostly driven by the constitutional crisis that we saw last year in 2023. That was when Netanyahu's government passed a bill stripping the Supreme Court of the right to declare, of the power to declare government decisions unreasonable. And we saw that this crisis was evolving for several months, and there were a lot of people protesting against it, against the change. And eventually, in January in 2024, the bill was revoked. However, since we measure only indicators for 2023, for this year, Israel falls out of the liberal democracy category. We don't know what happens this year, so we cannot predict whether it will be back or not.
All right. In the report, you argue that almost all components of democracy are getting worse in more countries than they are getting better compared to 10 years ago. Freedom of expression remains the worst affected component of democracy and is worsening in 35 countries in 2023. What is the underlying factor in this finding, both globally and domestically?
So I think you have to imagine yourself in the shoes of a wannabe dictator. What is one of the first things you would want to undermine? That's freedom of expression, and especially freedom of the media, the people that can write freely about what you're doing when you're in power, that can voice opposition against you, communicate what the real facts of the matter is, instead of the disinformation that you as a wannabe dictator seeks to distribute, and so on. You want to have control of especially the media sphere, but also civil society and other actors' ability to speak freely and openly. So it's not a big surprise to us, or it shouldn't be to anyone, that when we see a lot of countries moving in the wrong direction and autocratizing, that freedom of expression is the area that's affected the worst, and very often the first.
Right. You also underline in the report, and I quote, the wave of autocratization is notable. Autocratization is ongoing in 42 countries, home to 2.8 billion people, or 35% of the world population. India, with 18% of the world's population, accounts for about half of the population living in autocratizing countries. But you also argue that there might be signs that autocratization wave is slowing down, but one should be cautious with that interpretation. What are the signs that show the autocratization is slowing down, and why one should be cautious about it?
Yeah, so it really stems from the new methodology that we use for this year's report that has been developing over the past few years. And with that methodology, the number of autocratizing countries seems to be potentially declining from 47 to 42 in the last few years. And there's a little uptick in the number of countries democratizing. But because this new methodology is quite demanding for a country to qualify as being autocratizing, statistically significant and substantially meaningful, then it can take 2-3 years after the country starts moving down before it sort of qualifies to be an autocratizer by this demanding methodology. So this decline from 47 to 42, behind that are actually 25 countries that have started to decline that we call near misses, that have not yet qualified. Not all of them may qualify, but it takes only a handful of them to qualify to raise that 42 decline from 42 to 47 and raise it up again and even increase it. So while the curve sort of bent down a little bit in the last couple of years, that may change in the next 1 or 2 years here. So therefore, one should be cautious when interpreting that specific graph to be a proof or conclusive evidence that the wave of autocratization is slowing down.
Right. In your report, you highlight defiance in the face of autocratization, showcasing countries that have managed to reverse the democratic decline. Can you delve into key factors that contributed to these countries bouncing back, and how can their experiences inform strategies to combat autocratization globally?
Yeah, we did this last year. We did some very quick and dirty analysis of what factors drive mostly bouncing back democracies. And we identified 5 main factors. First, large-scale protests. And this is something that we know from the literature that is called like magic protests. So literally millions of people on the streets, like in South Korea, where we saw 2 million people protesting against autocratization. Then the second factor was unified opposition, often coalescing with civil society. And then we had like judicial independence, and that was also a very important factor in several cases. That is, the judiciary didn't bend over. They did not allow something what Nancy Bernal calls executive aggrandizement. And the fourth factor was critical elections, or sometimes some other major events, such as the end of the 2-term limits. And the fifth factor was international democracy support and protection. And it doesn't mean that all of those factors eventually protect you or help you to reverse democratization, but they seem to have played a role in almost all cases. And this is the major aspects that we think could play a role for democracy, for countries reversing autocratization and bouncing back. But of course, more proper research is needed. And just to give you some numbers, we started to do a research paper on trying to identify how many countries managed to reverse autocratization trend during the third wave of autocratization. And we see that around 70% of all countries managed to revert autocratization trends within maximum 5 years after autocratization ended. So in this sense, we think that there are pretty good chances that many countries that are now autocratizing will eventually bounce back.
Right. Academicians like Professor Staffan Levitsky of Harvard University and Professor Kurt Weiland of Texas University argue that the findings of V-Dem are exaggerated, and they underscore the resilience of democracy globally. How do you respond to this criticism?
You can respond to it in different ways, I guess. One is to say that we just reporting on the data, right? V-Dem is the largest data set on democracy in the world with 31 million data points, and we describe what the data says. And then you would have to argue that the data is wrong, and I haven't seen that from Stephen and Kurt really. Another thing is sort of the perspective. I mean, one of the pieces that Stephen has where he's made this argument together with Luke and Wei is to look at the countries that democratized during the third wave of democratization and see that surprisingly large share of them have been resilient. But that's only one part of the story, right? Because we have a number of countries that have been autocratizing now during the third wave of autocratization that were not part of the third wave of democratization. So you're only looking at a small slice of the total sample of countries in the world. Take India, for example, right? I think if one takes a global perspective, look at all the countries and their development since the late 1990s and what that has meant for the world, I cannot say that the picture is pretty. It's rather quite grim by almost any indicators you look for on democracy. I don't know if you want to add to that,
Yeah.
Marina.
I would add just briefly, I think it's the major question of how you measure the thing, democratic breakdown or democratic backsliding, because what I see in many papers is that they measure only the transition from democracy to autocracy as such. What they do not take into account sometimes is that the quality of democracy may be declining, and this is also a worrying trend. And then the second thing is that there is a moral obligation for us as researchers to be quite confident in what kind of claims we make. So if Stephen Levitsky wants to make a claim that there is no decline in democratic practices that we see in the world, that's a bit, I would say, like that sends a wrong message to people who are trying to protect democracy across the world. And this is really worrying, because we see that there are declines in media freedom, even in democracies. So resilience in terms that the democracy survives. Yeah, liberal democracies might not be affected, but many countries are declining in democratic quality, and this is worrying.
Right. Your research has shown worrying trends not only in autocracies like Russia and China, but also in countries classified as electoral democracies such as India, Hungary, and Turkey. Could you elaborate on the factors driving the democratic decline in these countries, and what measures can be taken to reverse this trend and strengthen democratic institutions?
Let me start by saying that neither India nor Hungary or Turkey are electoral democracies anymore. By our measures, they fall below that line and are now classified as electoral autocracies. Turkey has been an electoral autocracy since 2016 or 17 by our measures. Hungary after their 2018-19, and India shortly thereafter. So it's they are among the worst offenders, if you like, in terms of autocratization in the last decade and a half in the world. What measures can be taken to reverse the trends in these particular countries? I'm not sure. Naturally, it would have to involve sort of turning around a lot of people that right now support these autocrats and their parties. They are relatively popular among large segments of the population still. Maybe less so now Erdogan in Turkey, as the local elections recently showed. But it would take that. It would take some independence of the institutions like electoral management bodies that have been compromised in recent years. It would take freeing up of media space and freedom of expression more generally, and loosening up and a lot of loosening up of the conditions for civil society, and a lot of hard work by them, I'm sure, and probably international pressure. But I think experts who study these countries more intensively rather than us sort of looking at the global trends would be better placed to say something more specific about what could be done to reverse these trends in these particular countries.
Right. As you mentioned, I'm sure you followed local elections in Turkey that were held on March 31st and which Erdogan badly lost. In your last report, you categorized Turkey as electoral autocracy. Do you see his defeat as a venue for Turkey to bounce back from authoritarian politics?
Maybe, maybe not. I haven't been following the last week or so what's happened in Turkey. The initial reports I saw was that the opposition was prevented from assuming power, although winning. So in at least one of these major cities that the opposition won, it is at least it shows some sort of opening weakness potentially. But we don't know how far Erdogan and AKP are willing to go to stay in power. I guess the future will show that. At a minimum, it shows that there is a sizable opposition in Turkey. And that opposition will be at least a precondition for turning things around.
Right. In the interview you gave to Democracy Paradox, you talked about the possibility of Donald Trump to get reelected. How concerned are you about the possibility, and how do you think a possible reelection could galvanize autocrats globally?
I'm very concerned about Donald Trump getting reelected. I've said several times already in different public settings that if Donald Trump gets reelected in the present context, I don't think democracy in the US can survive that. And he's made his intentions, his dictatorial intentions very clear, plain and simple, even going so far as labeling Democrats vermin, which is an expression that's terribly, awfully close to Nazi Germany in the late 1930s and Rwanda in 1994. One should take statements like that very seriously. It would necessarily almost embolden autocrats around the world. He showed in his last term that he was very happy and to be cozying up with dictators in North Korea and with Putin in Russia and so on. So they know what they would be getting in that sense. So yeah, it would also, I mean, then we can go down the line what it would mean for NATO, the collaboration in NATO, and support for Ukraine in the war against Russia, and what it would mean for the Middle East and the ongoing conflicts there. And so it's overall a terrible outlook for the world, and not only for the United States.
Right, right. You highlighted the role of nationalist reactionary narratives in driving autocratization, citing examples such as Putin's Russia, Modi's India, and Erdogan's Turkey. How do you think these narratives interact with existing sociopolitical tensions within societies, and what strategies can be employed to counteract this influence?
Yeah, again, a difficult and complex question. and again, I think it's incumbent on us to say that I don't think social science have the full answers yet. What we do know is that there's a growing body of literature on using both experimental evidence on experiments with people, survey experiments, lab experiments, but also more popular opinion type surveys that show increasingly a clear relationship between people who feel socioeconomic relative deprivation. They feel typically the kinds of questions you ask are if you think your children will be better or worse off than yourself, or if you feel that you yourself are better or worse off than your parents, and people who feel they are worse off or will be worse off, or their children will be worse off, they are much more likely to vote for these far right nationalist reactionary political parties and leaders that drive autocratization if they come into power. So there is increasing evidence, I would say, of that link between socio-political or socioeconomic tensions and autocratization.
Right. And lastly, in your article, A Third Wave of Autocratization is Here, What is New About It? You argue that as it was premature to announce the end of history in 1992, it's premature to proclaim the end of democracy now. Do you still think the same, or do you have a more somber view about the global nature of democracies?
Of course, it's premature to declare the end of democracy. We hope that democracies will endure and regain strength, and that more people will enjoy democratic rights and freedoms and human rights and freedoms in the future than today. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to happen. For that, people will need to stand up for democracy. Both leaders around the world, but also people on the street stand up for democracy. And we hope that will happen.
Right.
What do you say, Marina?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's definitely premature, but like in our last article that is going to be published at the end of this month, we looked at some data, and what we see is that it looks like we have entered the era of instability. This is basically that like autocratization is often reverted, but also democratization is also often reverted. And that means that this paradigm of democracy promotion should now be shifted to more towards democracy protection. This is what we should keep in mind.
All right, dear Staffan and Marina, thank you so very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
All the best.
Bye.